Colm Kelleher arrived at Skinwalker Ranch with a specific kind of professional skepticism. He had a doctorate in biochemistry. He had spent years in pharmaceutical research, the kind of work where results are reproducible, where mechanisms are understood, where the gap between observation and explanation is a technical problem with a technical solution. He was trained to be careful about what he claimed and why. He was also, after years as scientific director of the National Institute for Discovery Science at the ranch, not able to say that nothing unusual had occurred there. This tension between rigorous training and the accumulated weight of what the investigation documented is what makes his account of the NIDS work more valuable than most writing in this field. He did not arrive at dramatic conclusions. He arrived at careful ones, and the careful conclusions, taken seriously, are more interesting than the dramatic ones would have been. This episode is about what the NIDS investigation actually found, how it was conducted, and what its findings honestly suggest. Not what they prove. The evidence does not establish proof of any specific explanation. What they suggest and what the limits of the investigation reveal about the nature of what was being studied. The National Institute for Discovery Science was established by Robert Bigelow in 1995, 1 year after he purchased the ranch from the Sherman family. Bigelow's background was real estate development. His interest in anomalous phenomena was long-standing and serious. He had funded research into near-death experiences and related subjects before turning his attention to the physical phenomena documented at the ranch. He understood that the ranch represented a concentrated, sustained, multi-phenomena location, unusual in the degree to which different categories of anomalous activity had been documented by credible witnesses over an extended period. His goal was straightforward: fund a systematic scientific investigation of the ranch, conducted by credentialed researchers using rigorous methodology at a level that no comparable civilian research effort had previously been able to sustain. The team he assembled reflected this ambition. Kelleher as scientific director, a former FBI special agent as the investigation's lead, PhD-level scientists in biology, chemistry, and physics, veterinary pathologists, materials scientists, former military and intelligence personnel with field investigation experience. This was not a paranormal investigation in the popular sense. It was a scientific team with relevant credentials and field experience, deployed to a location with a documented history of unusual events, with adequate resources to instrument the property comprehensively and maintain sustained observation over years. The basic structure of the investigation was sound. The physical evidence collected during the NIDS years is the most concrete part of the record and deserves careful examination. The cattle mutilation cases that continued during the investigation produced biological samples that were analyzed by veterinary pathologists. The findings were consistent with what independent pathologists had been reporting from cattle mutilation cases across the American West for decades. Incision characteristics inconsistent with predator feeding or conventional tools, selective organ removal in patterns inconsistent with opportunistic scavenging, and in some cases cellular changes at wound margins that the examining pathologists described as anomalous. What does this mean precisely? The pathologists who examined the samples documented characteristics they could not account for within the range of known mechanisms. That is a specific, bounded claim. It means the evidence is genuinely anomalous, not consistent with known explanations. It does not establish what the explanation is. Absence of a conventional explanation is not the same as confirmation of an unconventional one. The physical traces in soil and vegetation from other documented events showed similar characteristics. Scorched areas with geometric precision inconsistent with natural burning. Soil chemistry changes in localized areas without conventional heat sources identified. These findings were documented and are in the record. The electromagnetic monitoring produced readings that the team's physicists described as anomalous relative to known sources. Specific frequency signatures appearing in temporal correlation with reported events. This correlation is documented. Whether it reflects a causal relationship between the electromagnetic signatures and the events, or a common cause producing both, or coincidental correlation, is not established. The physical evidence is real. It is genuinely anomalous by the standards the examining scientists applied. What it indicates about what produced it is not resolved. The most significant finding of the NIDS investigation, the one that Kelleher has described most carefully and consistently in interviews over the years, was not any specific physical evidence. It was a pattern in how the phenomena related to the investigation itself. Over the years of sustained fieldwork, the team documented what appeared to be an inverse relationship between monitoring coverage and event frequency. When new instruments were deployed, events in the monitored categories became less frequent. When equipment was offline or the team's attention was elsewhere, events appeared to increase. The phenomena seemed to occur preferentially in gaps in the monitoring apparatus. This finding needs to be stated carefully, because it is easy to overinterpret. It is a real pattern in the documented data. The event distribution relative to monitoring coverage is documented and was noticed by trained investigators who were paying close attention. Kelleher has described it consistently across years of interviews. It is not a retrospective rationalization. What it means is genuinely uncertain. One interpretation: the phenomena are responsive to observation. Whatever was producing them was aware of the monitoring equipment and modified its behavior in response. This implies a high degree of intelligence and agency. Another interpretation: the presence of the monitoring equipment or of the investigating team itself physically altered conditions at the site in ways that suppressed the phenomena. If the phenomena depend on specific electromagnetic or other physical conditions, the introduction of additional equipment generating its own fields might interfere with those conditions without requiring any awareness. A third: the pattern is partially an artifact of documentation intensity. Events that occurred when the team was actively monitoring were recorded more completely than events during gaps, and the apparent concentration in gaps reflects documentation density rather than event density. Kelleher regarded the first interpretation as most consistent with the overall pattern. He held it as a hypothesis, not a conclusion. The data cannot distinguish between these interpretations on its own. What the finding does clearly establish is that the standard scientific assumption of a passive subject, a phenomenon that behaves the same, regardless of whether it is being studied, was not a safe assumption for this investigation. Whether that reflects genuine responsiveness or a physical interaction between the monitoring apparatus and the site conditions. The conventional methodology was not adequate to the subject. That is itself a significant finding. It tells us something about the nature of what was being studied, even without resolving what that nature is. There were specific events during the NIDS years that multiple team members observed directly and that the monitoring systems did not capture. The most discussed involves a structured aerial object observed by multiple trained observers near the property. The observers watched it for an extended period. They had multiple camera systems running at the time, positioned to cover the relevant area. The cameras did not record what the observers saw. This is documented. The observers are credible. The equipment was functional before and after. The event was not captured. There are straightforward explanations that should be considered first. Camera systems have coverage limits. Objects at certain angles or distances may not register on all systems. The specific geometry of the observation and the camera positions could account for a missed capture without implying anything unusual about the object itself. What makes this case harder to dismiss is that it was not an isolated failure. The pattern of events occurring in monitoring gaps was consistent. This particular instance was the most dramatic single example of that pattern, but it was part of a broader documented tendency. Whether the non-capture reflects the limitations of the equipment, the specific geometry of individual events, the phenomenon's responsiveness to monitoring, or something else entirely, is not established. The honest position: the observers reported a real observation. The equipment did not capture it. This is consistent with the broader pattern documented by the investigation. What explains the pattern is not resolved. The NIDS investigation's relationship to parallel government research programs is a dimension of the story that is documented in general terms and not in specific ones. What is documented? Several NIDS team members held active security clearances during their work at the ranch. Robert Bigelow's subsequent business relationship with government programs related to anomalous aerial phenomena, documented after the 2017 AATIP disclosure, included contracts that drew on the NIDS investigation period in ways not fully detailed in the public record. Former AATIP director Luis Elizondo has described, in general terms, government interest in the Uinta Basin that paralleled the NIDS civilian research. What this means specifically, what information was exchanged, what the government programs found in the same area, what the relationship between the classified and civilian investigations was, is not in the public record. Knapp has described from his source network a belief that the full scope of what was documented at and around the ranch exceeds what appears in the public record. He has said this carefully, distinguishing between what he knows and what he has been told. The gap between the civilian investigation's public findings and what the classified programs may have found is real in the sense that the gap exists. The content of that gap is genuinely unknown from outside the classification. It is worth noting this distinction. Acknowledging that a gap exists is different from claiming to know what is in it. The former is documented. The latter is speculation. The question of what the NIDS investigation established, not implied, not suggested, but established, is worth stating clearly at this point. It established that anomalous events occurred at the property during the investigation period, with physical evidence that qualified investigators could not conventionally explain. It established that a pattern existed in the relationship between monitoring coverage and event frequency that was not consistent with random event distribution or the standard assumption of a passive subject. It established, through the tissue analysis and physical trace documentation, that the physical evidence from several categories of events showed anomalous characteristics by the standards the examining scientists applied. These are findings. They are in the record. They have not been refuted. What the investigation did not establish is an explanation. The mechanism behind the cattle mutilation incisions, the source of the electromagnetic signatures, the cause of the monitoring gap pattern, the nature of what the team members observed that the cameras did not capture. Kelleher has been consistent about this for 20 years. He documents what was found. He does not claim to know what it means in the larger sense. His professional discipline, the same discipline that made him a credible investigator, prevents him from reaching beyond what the evidence supports. That discipline is worth recognizing. It is not common in this field, and it is the right approach to evidence of this kind. There is a specific conversation between Kelleher and Knapp that Knapp has referenced across years of public discussion. Late in the investigation, Knapp asked Kelleher directly, "After everything you've found, what do you think is at Skinwalker Ranch?" Kelleher's response, as Knapp has described it, "I think we are dealing with something that has been here for a long time. Something that has a level of awareness that is different from what our models prepare us for. Something that has been in relationship with human investigation for long enough to understand what investigation looks like and how to relate to it." He was careful to frame this as what he thought, his assessment based on the pattern of findings, not as what the evidence proved. He did not claim certainty. He offered his interpretation while holding it openly. Knapp then asked, "Does that frighten you?" Kelleher thought about it. Then he said, "It doesn't frighten me. It impresses me. Whatever this is, it's very good at what it does. And I think that quality, being very good at managing how it's perceived, has been mistaken for absence. The thing isn't absent. It's present in a way we haven't found adequate tools to engage with." This exchange captures something important about where the investigation arrived. Not at certainty, at a specific kind of uncertainty, informed, evidence-grounded, honest about its own limits. The uncertainty of someone who has looked carefully at the evidence and followed it where it led, without forcing a conclusion the evidence doesn't support. That is the right relationship to material of this kind. The legacy of the NIDS investigation is worth assessing honestly. What it produced? The most extensive physical documentation of a single high-strangeness location in the public record, conducted by a credentialed team using rigorous methodology with adequate resources, documented in a book that is careful about what it claims, available as a record that researchers can engage with. What it did not produce: a resolved explanation, the definitive evidence that would establish what produces the phenomena, the mechanism behind the physical anomalies, the framework that accounts for the monitoring gap pattern. Why not? The honest answer is that the investigation encountered a subject that its methodology was not designed to study. Not because the methodology was poorly designed, it was the right methodology for most research questions. But this particular subject appeared to behave differently when studied. That is not a failure of the investigation. It is a finding about the nature of the subject. Scientific methodology is built for passive subjects. The NIDS investigation documented what appeared to be a non-passive one. The right conclusion from that finding is not that the investigation failed. It is that a different kind of methodology is needed, one that accounts for the possibility that the subject is aware of and responsive to the investigation. What that methodology looks like is genuinely unknown. No one has developed it. The traditions of the indigenous communities whose territories encompass the relevant locations have their own approach, one built on relationship over generations rather than instrumental measurement over years. Whether the empirical knowledge those traditions encode is compatible with what Western science requires to count as knowledge is a question that has not been seriously engaged with. The NIDS investigation documented the boundary of what Western scientific methodology can find. What lies beyond that boundary is still being worked out. There is one more aspect of the investigation that is worth including before this episode closes. The NIDS team members who spent the most time at the ranch describe in their personal accounts something that the formal investigation documentation does not fully capture: the quality of the place, not its history, not its documented events. The quality of being there, the specific phenomenological character of spending extended time at a location where whatever was documented at the ranch was occurring. Multiple team members, in various interviews, describe a persistent sense of being monitored, not in specific incidents associated with specific events, as a background quality of their experience on the property. The sense that their presence was tracked, that the location was aware of them in a way that ordinary locations are not aware of the people in them. This is subjective experience. It cannot be measured with instruments. It is not physical evidence in the conventional sense, but it is consistent across independent accounts from people with professional training in distinguishing perception from imagination. People whose livelihood and credibility depended on accuracy of observation. People who had no professional incentive to report subjective experiences and significant professional disincentive to do so. They reported it anyway. Because it was there. Because it was real in the sense that their direct experience was real. The sense of being in a place that knows you are there. That is what the Skinwalker Ranch investigation found at its most fundamental level. Not the physical evidence, though the physical evidence is real and documented. Not the monitoring gap pattern, though the pattern is documented and significant. The quality of presence, of mutual awareness, that the instruments could not measure, but that the people who were there consistently described. In words that, when placed next to the traditional knowledge accounts from the surrounding Ute community, describe the same fundamental experience. Something in that valley is aware of the people who enter it. That has been the consistent finding of everyone who has spent serious time there. It was the consistent finding of the most rigorous scientific investigation the location has received. And it was the knowledge that the Ute tradition encoded long before the investigation arrived in protocols for how to behave when you enter places where that awareness is present. The investigation documented what the tradition already knew. The explanation for both remains outstanding. The cattle mutilation phenomenon deserves more specific examination than it typically receives in the popular coverage of Skinwalker Ranch. It is often presented as self-evidently mysterious: surgical wounds, no blood, no tracks, therefore inexplicable. But the honest engagement with the evidence requires acknowledging that the conventional explanation has more going for it than the ranch-focused coverage suggests. Veterinary researcher and skeptic Joe Nickell has documented extensively how the standard mutilation characteristics, the clean incisions, the organ removal, the absence of blood, are consistent with specific scavenger feeding patterns and with the natural decomposition process in dry conditions. Ravens, in particular, and blowfly larvae produce incision-like marks that can appear surgical to non-specialist observers. Blood drains and desiccates rapidly in warm conditions, leaving carcasses with less visible blood than observers expect. This explanation accounts for many reported cattle mutilation cases. It has been demonstrated in controlled observations and is supported by forensic veterinary analysis. What the NIDS team documented, however, was tissue analysis from specific cases that the examining veterinary pathologists described as inconsistent with this conventional explanation. The specific cellular characteristics at wound margins were the key finding, not simply the appearance of the wounds, but their microscopic structure. The honest position: the conventional explanation accounts for the majority of historical cattle mutilation reports and should be considered first. The specific cellular findings from some NIDS-examined cases appear to go beyond what the conventional explanation predicts. Whether this reflects genuine anomaly or a limitation in the analysis methodology is not definitively established. That is a more careful statement than either "it's obviously scavengers" or "it's obviously unexplainable." Both of those positions ignore evidence that cuts against them. The cellular findings are in the record. They deserve serious evaluation. They do not by themselves establish what mechanism produced them. The poltergeist phenomena documented during the NIDS years are the category of evidence that is hardest to evaluate from the outside. Object movement, sounds without apparent source, equipment found in altered states. These are reported by the Sherman family and by NIDS team members. They are genuinely subjective in the sense that they depend primarily on witness testimony rather than physical evidence that can be independently examined. What distinguishes the Skinwalker Ranch poltergeist accounts from typical reports is that multiple independent witnesses described the same kinds of events over an extended period. This is not a single family reporting things others cannot verify. It is multiple people, including trained investigators, who arrived specifically to evaluate what was occurring, describing consistent experiences over years. This is better evidence than a single-source report. It is not as strong as instrumentally captured evidence. The honest framing: the poltergeist events are the weakest physical evidence category in the NIDS documentation. They are not fabricated. Too many independent witnesses, too many years, too much consistency. But they are the category where alternative explanations, suggestion, misperception under unusual conditions, the specific psychology of extended fieldwork in an isolated location, are hardest to fully rule out. They are part of the record. They should be held more lightly than the physical evidence categories. The broader significance of the NIDS investigation for the field of anomalous research is worth stating plainly. Before the NIDS investigation, serious scientific engagement with high strangeness locations was essentially absent. The field was dominated by enthusiasts without research training and skeptics who dismissed the subject without examining the evidence. The middle ground, trained investigators taking the evidence seriously and applying rigorous methodology, was almost empty. The NIDS investigation occupied that middle ground. Whatever the ultimate explanation for what was documented at the ranch, the investigation was conducted with more methodological rigor than anything that preceded it in the civilian domain. This matters because it established a standard. It showed what serious investigation of anomalous phenomena looks like when done with adequate resources and professional expertise. It produced a record that can be examined, critiqued, and built upon. The investigation's findings are not its only contribution. Its methodology is the demonstration that this subject can be approached with the same seriousness as any other research question. That demonstration was more needed than it might appear in retrospect. In 1996, when the investigation began, the serious scientific study of anomalous phenomena was not a recognized research activity. The NIDS work did not make it one in any official sense. The institutional resistance documented throughout this series remained in place, but it produced a template. The template matters for what comes next. Whatever investigation eventually closes the gap between the documented anomalies and a satisfying explanation will build on the NIDS methodology, learn from its limitations, and extend its reach. That is a real contribution, regardless of what the ranch phenomena ultimately turn out to be. There is something honest to say about the limitations of this episode's own framing. This episode, and the series it belongs to, has been building a picture of anomalous phenomena at Skinwalker Ranch, in the wilderness cluster zones, in the government's classified programs, that is atmospheric and cumulative. The weight of the accumulated narrative tends toward certainty. Each episode adds another layer to a picture that feels, by this point, fairly complete. It is not complete. The Skinwalker Ranch evidence is real and genuinely anomalous. The NIDS investigation was rigorous, and its findings are documented. Colm Kelleher is a credentialed scientist who reached careful conclusions based on careful observation. And the explanation for what was occurring at the ranch remains genuinely unknown. Not unknown in the sense that the answer exists somewhere in classified archives and the public just hasn't been told. Unknown in the more fundamental sense that the question of what mechanism produces these phenomena has not been answered anywhere, by anyone, in any framework. The government classified programs may have better data. They may have found things the civilian investigation did not, or they may have found the same things the civilian investigation found and reached the same honest conclusion, genuinely anomalous, not yet explained. The gap between the documented anomalies and a satisfying explanation is real and significant. Filling it with "the government knows but won't say" is a narrative convenience that the available evidence does not fully support. What the evidence supports: the phenomena are real, the investigation was rigorous, the findings are documented, and the explanation is not yet established. Those facts are significant enough on their own. The scientists who worked at Skinwalker Ranch carry the experience with them, not loudly, not with the evangelical enthusiasm of converts, with the specific weight of people who encountered something that changed their relationship to what they considered possible. Kelleher has described this change carefully, not a conversion to belief in any specific explanation, a widening of the space of what he considers might be real, a recalibration of prior probabilities based on evidence that he found he could not honestly dismiss. This is the appropriate response to evidence of this kind, not certainty, updated uncertainty. The adjustment that honest engagement with anomalous evidence produces in people who are genuinely trying to follow where the evidence leads. The NIDS investigation produced that adjustment in trained scientists who began with significant skepticism. That is not nothing. It is perhaps the most credible finding of the entire investigation, not the tissue samples, or the electromagnetic data, or the monitoring gap pattern. The adjustment in the probability assessments of trained scientists who look carefully at the evidence and found they could not maintain their prior skepticism in full. That adjustment points towards something. What it points toward is still being worked out by Kelleher, by Knapp, by the researchers who have engaged seriously with the record, and by whoever engages seriously with what comes next. In the investigation that the NIDS work made possible, by demonstrating that the subject is worth taking seriously, with the rigor it deserves. The NIDS investigation produced a specific body of documented anomalies at a specific location over a specific period. That record exists and is worth examining carefully. What the record shows, honestly summarized, physical evidence from cattle mutilation cases that veterinary pathologists described as anomalous, specifically cellular characteristics at wound margins inconsistent with the range of known cutting mechanisms. This is a genuine finding. It should be held alongside the reality that the conventional scavenger explanation accounts for the majority of historical mutilation reports, and that the specific cellular findings from NIDS cases have not been subjected to the kind of independent multi-lab replication that would make them conclusive. Electromagnetic signatures without conventional sources, documented in temporal correlation with reported events. The correlation is real. Whether it reflects a causal relationship is not established. A pattern of events appearing to concentrate in gaps in monitoring coverage. The pattern is documented across years of fieldwork by trained observers. What produces the pattern? Genuine responsiveness to observation, physical interference from monitoring equipment, documentation artifact, or something else, is not established. Direct witness observations by credentialed investigators of phenomena not captured by monitoring equipment. These observations are real and reported honestly. The absence of instrumental capture does not mean the observations were not genuine. Cameras have coverage limits. It also does not confirm anything about the nature of what was observed. These findings taken together constitute a genuine research record. They are not fabricated. They are not the product of credulous observers. They are the documented findings of a professional scientific team that conducted a multi-year investigation at a well-resourced level. They are also genuinely uncertain in their implications. They establish that anomalous things occurred. They do not establish what produced them. That is the honest summary of what the NIDS investigation found. The following section addresses something that this series has not always been careful enough about. The series has, at various points, used language that implies more certainty about the nature of the phenomena than the evidence supports. Phrases like ancient presences, something that manages its own detectability, what the classified archives hold. These create a coherent narrative frame, but they build in assumptions that the evidence does not establish. The phenomena at Skinwalker Ranch are genuinely anomalous. Anomalous means they deviate from what known explanations predict. It does not mean they are supernatural, interdimensional, or the product of non-human intelligence. Those are possible explanations. They are not the only ones, and the evidence, taken honestly, does not establish any of them over the others. This matters for how the series is heard. Documentary framing that builds toward increasing certainty, even with restrained language, shapes what listeners conclude. If the evidence is genuinely uncertain, the documentary should preserve that uncertainty rather than resolving it through accumulated narrative weight. The NIDS investigation itself is a model for this. Kelleher documented what he found. He stated what the findings suggested to him. He did not claim more certainty than the evidence supported. The book he wrote with Knapp is careful about this in ways that many subsequent accounts of the ranch are not. The standard the NIDS investigations set, rigor, documentation, honest acknowledgement of limits, is the right standard for engaging with this material. This episode aims to meet that standard. The reader can judge whether it does. There are two things that the NIDS investigation clearly established that are worth stating as conclusions rather than suggestions. First, the location has a documented history of anomalous physical events that qualified investigators could not conventionally explain. This is established by the physical evidence record, the tissue samples, the electromagnetic data, the physical traces. These findings are specific, documented, and have not been refuted by subsequent analysis. Second, the standard assumption of conventional scientific methodology that the subject of investigation is passive and behaves consistently regardless of observation context was not a safe assumption for this investigation. The monitoring gap pattern is documented and real. Whatever its explanation, it means the conventional approach was not adequate this subject. Both conclusions are significant. Neither requires exotic explanations to be significant. The first tells us that something unusual was occurring. The second tells us that studying it required something beyond what was deployed. What the something unusual is, and what the something beyond standard methodology looks like, those remain open questions. The NIDS investigation advanced the record. It did not close these questions. That is an honest assessment of its contribution. And an honest assessment is the right ending for an episode about investigators who set the standard for honest assessment in this field. The investigation at Skinwalker Ranch ended in the formal sense when the NIDS program concluded. The property changed hands again. The television productions arrived. The popular coverage expanded. But the questions the investigation raised are still open. Kelleher still does not claim to know what was at the ranch. 20 years after the investigation, his position remains what it was when the work concluded. The evidence is genuine. The anomalies are real. The explanation is not established. That intellectual honesty, the refusal to reach further than the evidence takes him, is more valuable than a confident answer would be, because the confident answers that have been offered for what is at Skinwalker Ranch are not supported by evidence at the level the investigation produced. What the investigation produced is a careful, documented record of genuine anomalies at a specific location and an honest acknowledgement that the tools deployed were not adequate to explain them. That record is available. It deserves to be engaged with honestly, not as confirmation of a preferred explanation, as evidence that raises specific questions that have not yet been answered. In the Uinta Basin, where the investigation documented the shape of what it could not find, which is perhaps the most useful thing a first serious investigation of a genuinely difficult subject can do. There is one more honest observation worth making before this episode closes about the relationship between what the NIDS investigation found and how it has been subsequently presented. The investigation produced a careful, qualified record. The book Kelleher and Knapp published reflects that care. It distinguishes consistently between what was observed and what it might mean. It acknowledges methodological limitations. It holds conclusions loosely. Much of what has been written and broadcast about Skinwalker Ranch since then does not maintain those standards. The television productions, the podcast episodes, the YouTube documentaries, they use the NIDS findings as raw material for narratives that are more confident than the findings support. This series has not been entirely immune to that tendency. The atmospheric language of documentary narration, the slow builds, the weighted pauses, the cumulative sense that the picture is coming together creates pressure toward resolution that the evidence itself resists. The honest response to the NIDS record is uncertainty, not resolution. The anomalies are real. The explanation is not established. The investigation set a methodological standard that subsequent work should meet and build on. That is less satisfying than a clear answer. It is more accurate. The Skinwalker Ranch evidence deserves engagement at the level the NIDS investigation set. Rigorous, careful, honest about limits. Not the level of the television productions that came after. The difference matters. The NIDS investigation was a genuinely unusual undertaking. A private funder with real resources assembled a credentialed team and gave them time to work seriously on a subject that mainstream institutions would not touch. Whatever one concludes about the phenomena they were studying, the effort itself was serious. Kelleher has said, in various forms across many interviews, that the experience changed his relationship to uncertainty. Not that it gave him answers, that it showed him how much larger the range of possible things in the world might be than his training had suggested. That is a specific kind of intellectual result, not a discovery in the conventional sense, a recalibration of what needs to be explained. The phenomena at the ranch are real enough, documented carefully enough by qualified enough observers to warrant that recalibration. They are not proof of any specific explanation. They are evidence that the frameworks currently available are not complete. That is where the NIDS record leaves the question, with more to explain than before the investigation began, and better documentation of what needs explaining, which is, for a first serious investigation of a genuinely difficult subject, the right kind of progress.